the 3 points that I would want to highlight are the emergency response benefit. That came out as a measure to try to protect Canadians that were losing their job as a result of COVID-19. It became very apparent in the first week or two that the amount of individuals that were going to be suffering some type of job dislocation was going to overwhelm the EI system. It wasn't designed in that way to have that many Canadians seeking assistance all at one time. And that's why our government created the emergency response benefit for individuals that both who were EI eligible, qualify for this benefit, and those that were not. And as many of you would know, it pays $2,000 a month, up to 16 weeks, or up to 4 months for up to 16 weeks. And essentially, individuals apply in 4-week increments in terms of their own specific situation. And the criteria is individuals who have earned at least $5,000 in the past 12 months and have either lost their job or unable to work as a result of COVID-19. Last week, our government announced that this would also be extended to seasonal workers because there was a question mark of whether or not individuals that would consistently be coming back to seasonal opportunity, whether or not they would qualify to serve. We've clarified that they will. And of course, also for individuals that their EI eligibility is coming to an end after January 1st and they're unable to find a job, they also qualify for this benefit as well. I think on the whole, it's been a successful program to try to provide money to people that need the help the most. We have heard from small business owners and individuals that are in that wage range of about $12 to $17 that this has been a disincentive in some respects in terms of having workers say, well, I'm going to go home. I'm not willing to work because I'm going to go home, collect this benefit. And my reminder to all small business owners is that these individuals cannot collect this benefit for simply refusing to work. And there will be repercussions on the other side in terms of vetting and auditing for individuals to be able to actually illustrate that was the case. So far, 5.4 million Canadians have accessed this benefit. That was as of last week. That may have changed certainly over the weekend, but it just shows the level of unprecedented nature that what we're facing. In a normal situation, this time of year, there might be 27,000 Canadians that were on EI, and we recognize the magnitude of what we're asking individuals to say and the impact it's having on certainly the majority of businesses as a result. The second piece is the Canada Emergency Business Account. This was created as a way to provide a short-term stimulus and loans to businesses that need the help to get through COVID-19. And the way it was first introduced was for businesses that had payroll between $50,000 and $1 million. And essentially, businesses were able to access up to $40,000 interest-free loan through their financial institution. My understanding is that has rolled out. It's different between each financial institution. My understanding that RBC was pretty quick, and other banks are kind of following suit as they get their own protocol in place. But it allows businesses to access that capital, as I mentioned, up to the $40,000 limit, interest-free until 2025. And the businesses are able to pay back 75% of that loan before December 31st, 2022. Then the 25% portion is actually forgivable. So for a business that borrowed $40,000, the entire limit, if they paid back at least $30,000 by that December 31st, 2022 deadline, the $10,000 would be forgivable. I heard a tremendous amount of feedback from small businesses in East Hants who said, look, we're sole proprietors, or we're individuals who, my wife and I work in the business, and we might have a couple other employees whose salary might total $30,000, $35,000, $40,000. This $50,000 pay threshold is detrimental to us. There was a number of other MPs also articulating those same points, that we had to lower the threshold. So last week we actually amended the threshold in terms of who was eligible. So that it has now gone down to $20,000 of payroll and up to $1.5 million as the threshold for businesses that can access this. I know in getting a sneak peek at some of the questions that might be asked today, there are other businesses that would not have any payroll. They either work with independent contractors or take it in as a loan. They really don't have any salary payroll. I will say that discussions are ongoing internally about whether or not we can extend that even further. And MPs, including myself, have highlighted that challenge for certain businesses. And I guess what I would say is we're doing our best to get as many programs out the door as quickly as possible to cover as many Canadians. We know that there's nuances. The Prime Minister has acknowledged that there's gaps accordingly, but we are doing our best to try to reach as many people. The last piece of kind of the three-point plank is the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy. That passed Parliament, I guess it would be last Saturday. And really, the emergency wage subsidy is meant to benefit businesses that have been able to demonstrate that they had a significant loss in gross revenue. And it's meant to try to ensure that employers and employees can keep that relationship. So following COVID-19, we don't have a real dislocation between the employees and the employers, and hopefully we can get back to basically moving the economy ahead as quickly as possible. And so what businesses are eligible? Essentially, the criteria is a business has to demonstrate that it has had at least a 15% gross decline in revenue in March, or a 30% gross decline revenue in April and May. And how you benchmark that is versus your month in question in 2019. So, my business would be comparing to March of 2019 versus my March of 2020. If I've been able to demonstrate a 15% decline, then I would be eligible for the qualifying period, and I will explain that. We heard from a lot of small businesses that were what we would call growth businesses, where, March 2019, they might have had 2 employees, and because of the relative success of their business, they took off. They were trying to grow their business accordingly. And, for example, they might have had revenue of $50,000 a month in March 2019. They were expected to have revenues of $100,000 in March 2020. They only had $50,000 revenue, so they wouldn't be able to show 30% or 15% decline year over year. We're allowing businesses in those cases, or where it makes sense, to compare their average of January and February 2020 as a way to be able to benchmark for businesses that were growing year over year, so to speak, to try to make that a little bit more equitable. I would say that there is still businesses that really don't. How would I say it? Their revenue is not tied month over month. So the best example is agriculture, where the labor that's being put in the months in question, i.e. March 15th to June 6th, is tied to revenue that might occur outside the period in question. And this has been something that's been highlighted. I'm not sure necessarily whether or not we're going to get a change in the emergency wage subsidy, but we're cognizant and I think we're open to changes as we go along, as we have done for the number of other policy in place. So what I want to highlight for businesses is the qualifying period. The way the legislation was set up was, if you could demonstrate in March that you had that 15% gross decline, you automatically qualify for the periods in question, which is March 15th to April 11th. That's qualifying period number 1. April 12th to May 9th is qualifying period number 2, and then May 10th to June 6th is qualifying period number 3. So, for example, if you were a business that suffered a 20% decline in gross revenue in March of 2020, you would automatically qualify for the remuneration of the salary that you paid from March 15th to April 11th and April 12th to May 9th. You automatically get the first 2 periods. In April, let's just say you had a 30% decline in revenue as a result of COVID-19 as well. You would automatically qualify for, of course, April 12th to May 9th, but you would also qualify for May 10th, June 6th. And then finally, if in May that was the only period you can illustrate that 30% gross decline, you would obviously qualify for May 10th to June 6th as a period in which you can actually be rebated 75% of the remuneration paid to salaries during that period in question.
Kody,
so those are kind of the big 3 planks that we've released. When we compare it internationally to what other countries have done, for example, in the UK, they've had a 75% wage subsidy, and that's largely been their biggest piece. There's been other ancillary pieces around it. We've certainly tried to focus on supporting employees through the emergency wage subsidy. But also, it also obviously helps businesses as well. The emergency business account and the CERB are all measures that are introduced to try to help either employed individuals in the case of CERB, or the emergency business account for small business owners. One point I did miss in relation to the emergency response benefit. Again, it was a policy that was built on either you have income and you don't qualify for the CERB, or you've lost your income as a result of COVID-19 and you do qualify. And right away, that's something that certainly I recognized East Hants was going to be a bit of an issue, because it was not always black and white in terms of you fully have your job or you fully lost your job. There was a lot of kind of I still have 10 hours where I'm working, or circumstances where I've lost one job, but I still have 10 hours where I work on the weekends at Tim Hortons. This means I don't qualify. So we've actually allowed individuals to both collect the CERB and also earn up to $1,000 a month. So we try not to stepping away from kind of some of the piecemeal work that might be available, and that was certainly a welcomed change that in my mind, and I think for many. Some of the other things, the Canada Child Benefit for individuals and families, was something that was strengthened along the way. For people that receive GST, there was investments there to try to make sure that people have the money that they need in the short term. Last week, the Prime Minister also announced essentially a doubling of the budgets for the regional development agencies. So that would be for COA, which would also include the Community Futures Program. In our language in Nova Scotia, that's the Community Business Development Corporations in our area, and the team that works here in our riding. And also some investments in the energy sector. So some cleaning up of oil wells in Alberta as a way to try to drive employment, also stimulate the economy, but do so in a way that is in tying with our environmental agenda. So those are kind of the big three, along with, again, there seems to be announcements every day. The spending, of course, has been significant, but the times are quite unprecedented at the same time. I know I have a few questions in relation to that, and I'm happy to answer them. But Amy, I don't want to do all the talking. I'd rather allow your members to ask some questions. I can do my best to engage with my answers that I have available.
Okay, Kody, can you hear me?
I sure can.
All right. A little bit of what you were saying was garbled, so I just have a follow-up because you faded out on this. But when you were talking about period 2 for the eligibility, so if you hit the 15% in period 1, you're eligible in period 2, but do you also have to have a 30% decline in period 2 as well?
No, you do not. So, sorry, I know you're getting a little bit of feedback. My apologies on that. If you do meet the 15% gross decline threshold in March, you automatically qualify for the wages eligible from March 15th to April 11th, which is the first qualifying period, but also from April 12th to May 9th. So you would not have to demonstrate that you also had a 30% decline in April. That's the way the legislation is built. It's trying to be a little bit forward-looking.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that. If anyone
the other piece that I'll also articulate is in terms of eligible employees, that is one in the definition. Our government is trying to avoid situations where employers might say, well, you know what, I don't have consistent work, but I'll hire you back on certain increments throughout the qualifying period in question. So the way that the legislation reads is employees that within the qualifying period, so let's say it was March 15th to April 11th, if there was 14 days in that period where an employee didn't receive their normal baseline salary or were essentially not remunerated from the employer, they're not eligible. And the reason that is being created both in the periods in question backwards and moving forward is we are trying to make sure that employers bring back their employees for the entire period in question and pay them their regular salary. So, you could have maybe 10 days in a qualifying period where you don't, where those wages would not be, where they still would be eligible. But if there's 14 days within the qualifying period where the employee does not receive remuneration, essentially you can't qualify for the emergency wage subsidy in question. So for any employers right now where it's April 20th and the second period in question is now started, which is April 12th, to May 9th, maybe you haven't paid your employees for 8 days, but this makes sense or it's going to qualify, you might want to be able to get them back on board so that you don't have that 14-day period in question, if that makes sense.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that. And I just want to say, if anyone has follow-up questions or needs anything clarified, there is a chat option, a Q&A at the bottom, and you can just type your questions in and we'll be able to see them. So Kody, the first question that I have for you from a member is, the current situation has involved unprecedented spending by our government in addition to a substantial drop in revenues. What action is the government considering in order to start to move the national debt level back to normal, i.e., what level of taxation can businesses and people expect to see?
So first of all, what I would remind everyone is there's no question over the last, I wasn't part of it from 2015 to 2019, but our government did run deficits in a way to invest in Canadians, whether it was through infrastructure or social spending. You know, unemployment was at an all-time, no, I don't want to say an all-time low, it was a 40-year low. We hadn't had unemployment that low since 1976. So certainly I think the investments were beneficial during the time. Obviously, right now, we've spent almost the equivalent of a year's budget to try to address the pandemic that we're all seeing. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find too many Canadians that would suggest that that wasn't a prudent measure to try to protect businesses, to make sure that they didn't go bankrupt, to try to provide liquidity in the market for those businesses that are facing challenges, and indeed Canadians across the board. The big question, of course, is what we do afterwards, and those I would argue are conversations we're having internally right now in terms of what comes after COVID-19. Once we are able to actually either have a vaccine in place or start to loosen up the economy, which is, I still think a number of months down, I don't want to say a number of months, but a number of weeks down the road, we as a government are asking ourselves, is it infrastructure spending? Is it a bit of liquidity to ensure that businesses still have the help they need? Is it sectoral specific? And those are conversations that are ongoing. Certainly I can say from my perspective, I do believe that a lot of this spending is temporary in nature. And we're going to have to ask ourselves the question as a government is, when we go into the next election, how do we manage ourselves out of this? And so I certainly appreciate the question. And in my mind, some of our spending, of course, is going to have to be reined in because it is not feasible to continue this type of spending. But I don't think any government would suggest that would be the plan moving forward.
Okay, thanks, Kody. So the next question that we have here, it has a few parts to it, but the thrust of the question is, due to the urgency of the almost universal spending that has occurred, there has been no time spent evaluating the actual needs of businesses or individuals who are accessing these funds. So the parts are, how will the government determine what businesses and individuals can have their assistance clawed back, and will the government be clawing them back?
I guess what I would say is a lot of our programs are built in trying to assess need. There are some, of course, like the emergency business account that's available to businesses based on their payroll and not necessarily on a particular decline in their overall business activity. Those were being put out in addition to some of the work that was done around Export Development Canada with credit facilities to ensure liquidity in the market. In terms of individuals, it's been made clear that well, in fact, it's a criminal offense if in terms of you're found lying in terms of accessing benefits. So there will be auditing on the other side to ensure that individuals that are accessing, whether it's CERB or some of the other ones that are required to apply, whether or not they actually met that threshold. In terms of businesses themselves, in terms of clawing back, you know, I don't think that there's necessarily anything in place. There will be, there's provisions under the emergency wage subsidy that says that if businesses are somehow found to be I guess I'll say, working their numbers in a way that would be advantageous, then they could be found to be penalized in those circumstances. But really the focus at this point is getting out support to Canadians that need the help. Businesses need the liquidity. We want to be able to keep small businesses operating to the extent that we can. We can't bankroll the entire private economy, but we're certainly doing our best to make sure that people have the support that they need.
Okay, thank you, Kody. So the next question that we have here is about the gig economy, which has gained popularity and traction the past few years. So the current situation has exposed a huge gap in the economy between those that are classified as employees and those in the gig economy or other sole proprietors. The government has not allowed these people to pay into EI. Will this policy now be adjusted for the future or allow this group to have a special programming? And what other steps will be taken to ensure that this group contributes to some sort of fund similar to EI?
And Amy, just before I ask, before I go, is the feedback a little bit better now?
Yes. I think
Okay.
maybe just speak a bit slowly. I'm not sure why we're getting a little bit of feedback from it, but I think maybe when you speed up, that's when we're having problems.
Okay, well, I certainly appreciate the question. I mean, this is one of the things that our government grappled with the emergency response benefit. Was it was clear that there was individuals that were going to need support, that were losing their job, that were self-employed, that would not otherwise be eligible through EI. And that's in large part why the emergency response benefit was created, was to ensure that individuals that did not contribute in that manner still had some type of support. And certainly had heard from a lot of individuals that were in those situations that were self-employed about whether or not they would qualify. We had a lot of small businesses that said, look, whether they were micro businesses, sole proprietors, or maybe they had one staff, they said, you know, I might make $2,000 or $3,000 a month. I'm now making $250 a month or $500 a month. I don't qualify for the CERB. And as a result, you know, I'm forced to make the decision between whether or not I close my business to collect the benefit because of COVID-19, or do I try to keep mitigating my losses? So I guess what I would say, you know, we recognize that as it relates to kind of self-employed individuals and their ability to access the CERB and still make up to $1,000 a month. The question around broader policies in the days ahead about contribution from self-employed individuals into a particular fund, I guess what I would say is those conversations very well could be welcomed. You know, if there's a particular member that asked it, happy for them to follow up with me individually, and we can have those conversations, because you know, maybe those are things that we should be looking at as a government in the days ahead.
Okay, thank you, Kody. So for companies and individuals that do not or cannot avail themselves of the universal assistance that is currently available, will the government be looking at some sort of downstream incentive? And I know that you've touched on this a little bit, but you can just speak to that a bit more.
Sure. Look, we know, despite the fact that we've rolled out unprecedented amount of social spending to try to support businesses and individuals alike, there still are gaps. And as I mentioned, our government will be looking down the road in terms of what needs to come next. In terms of incentives, I think that there's an opportunity, particularly in the hospitality and tourism sector, to provide tax credits in terms of trying to incentivize Canadians to maybe get out to tourism destinations domestically. I don't have a crystal ball about where this is all headed, but I would suggest that, you know, international travel will be dampened, at least for probably a 24-month period, until this is completely quelled. And so if we do get to the point that public health officials are allowing for domestic travel or interprovincial travel, I think tax credits that are going to be incentivized to get businesses to change behavior, or not businesses, individuals to change behavior, to get out and support local businesses or businesses that are most impacted as a result of COVID-19 would be beneficial. You know, there's still, what I would argue, sectoral considerations. We need a functioning airline after this is all said and done. We know how impacted they are right now. Living in East Hants, we know how many people are employed at the international airport and make their livelihoods there. So I think that you will see, despite our best efforts for broad sector policies, there still may be some sectoral benefits to try to, whether it is downstream or currently, to try to make sure that we can stabilize those industries.
Okay, thank you, Kody. So the next question is, when we emerge from this crisis, we will need a strong statement that this current situation is absolutely unique and that bailouts will not continue indefinitely. Is this a statement that your government is prepared to make?
I guess what I would say is all of this is unprecedented. Our government didn't walk into 2020 expecting this to necessarily happen. And really at this point, our government will be looking at ways to try to congeal and make sure that we have liquidity for businesses. The alternative simply would have been to not intervene and to see small businesses across the board and large businesses suffer hardship, and the economic consequences would have been very grave. So I guess what I would say, speaking as a member of Parliament for the governing party and not necessarily a member of the executive, our government will be looking at ways in which we need to get back to more of a fiscal footing. It is not sustainable to run $200 billion plus deficits a year. We know that, and I don't think any Canadian is expecting that to happen. So as it relates to bailouts writ large for industry, I know that those conversations are ongoing internally about what sectors may need even more specific help, as opposed to a bailout. Just what can we do for sectors like tourism, hospitalities, other businesses that are built around bringing people together, which is obviously not possible during this time.
Okay, thank you, Kody. So this next question is one that we are getting asked time and time again from our members. It seems that a lot of people are directly impacted by this. So many small business owners receive dividends as opposed to a salary. The taxes paid for business owners receiving salary or dividends are the same. However, the 75% wage subsidy does not cover business owners receiving dividends. So in addition, the current emergency loan eligibility only looks at companies having 20,000 of payroll and does not consider dividend compensation. Is this being discussed, and is there a plan in place to address this glaring issue?
Well, thank you for the question. Certainly appreciate, as I mentioned in my comments, that not all businesses are built equal, and particularly in Kings Hants, we have a number of what I would say family-owned businesses where, again, it might be individuals are, as you mentioned, taking dividends as opposed to wages, or have a lot of independent contractor relationships as opposed to direct employees. So these are conversations that are ongoing internally within our government. Certainly with the emergency response benefit, there was questions around whether or not dividends would qualify as income to allow individuals in those circumstances to benefit from the CERB. We have allowed that in terms of allowing dividends to count as income. And I do know that there's conversations internally about whether or not it should be extended to $20,000, whether it's independent contractors' bills or dividends that would be a equivalent of that nature. So I don't have any more to provide other than that we're cognizant of that and we're looking to see if it can be addressed.
Well, I'm sure that our members will be happy to hear that that one is getting looked at. Okay, so what is your focus for Kings Hants business recovery, and what steps are being taken now in order to support the recovery, especially where prior to COVID, we've had a lot of businesses hard hit with the closure of Northern Pulp?
Sure. So what I would say is it would be naive of me just to come out and say there's one mold that's going to fit the realities of Kings Hants business. I guess my observations would be agriculture is one of the backbones of the economy, whether or not it's the supply managed sectors, mostly in Hants County, and then even broader in the Annapolis Valley. So I've been working with the Minister of Agriculture in relation to some of the challenges we're seeing in the processing sector, in the food chain. We're also, I would argue, particularly in the Annapolis Valley and in portions of Hants County along the Bay of Fundy, we're tied to tourism. There are organizations and businesses along the 215 and throughout our area that are reliant on that. And so my hope is that we're going to have something specific that can speak to them, that can try to address some of their challenges. More on the East Hants side of things, obviously the airport is a massive economic generator. I've had conversations with Joyce Carter about some of the challenges that they're facing, and we know across the country, it's not just Halifax, it's truly across the country as our air travel is reduced. So certainly we're going to have to be cognizant of ensuring that economic engine, not just for East Hants, but for our entire region, is stable and has the needs, the resources that it needs to continue. My mind would be looking to see whether or not we could have specific tax credits set aside for small business. We did lower small business taxes from 11% down to 9% in the last parliament. There was changes around, obviously, taxation of how the corporation is structured, and we know that that was challenging for certain business owners as well. I heard that on the doorsteps during the election. So I guess what I would say is, there's a focus on agriculture, there's a focus on the airport, tourism, and hospitality. As it relates to the forestry industry, obviously, whether it's Elmsdale Lumber, Leadwood, and others, we have a lot of contractors that work in the woods. The decision to not move forward with Boat Harbor was provincial, but we know that there could be strategic investments that can be made in the forestry sector to help position it for success in the days ahead. And I think the Premier himself has made it clear that he believes forestry has a future in this province. On the federal side, before COVID-19 kind of took hold, a lot of our discussions as a Nova Scotia Liberal caucus was about ways that we could advocate for specific investment in a strategic way to position the forestry sector for successful days ahead. I know from speaking to our business owners that are in those industries, there have been individuals that have been approaching them about investments that could take up some of the wood chips that were not being able to be taken by Northern Pulp, and that could really position their business for success in the days ahead. And those are things that I'll continue to try to be a champion for and advocate for internally to make our government see the value in them.
Okay, so Kody, I just heard you speak about agriculture, and we do have a specific question related to agriculture. So with the focus now on food security in Canada and in Nova Scotia, does the government have any plan to provide a subsidy for local food so that it's affordable for all Nova Scotians to get their food locally from Nova Scotia?
Well, I think it's an important question. I don't obviously have an answer whether or not we'll move forward with a local food subsidy. What I will say as a member of the Standing Committee on Agriculture federally, I have had close conversations with the minister at the federal level, Marie-Claude Bibeau, and Minister Colwell provincially. I think across the board, what we're all going to have to ask ourselves after COVID-19 is that there might be a readjustment of our industrial policy writ large in this country. We're seeing some of the processing bottlenecks that are happening in central Canada and the United States, which is having a downstream impact on our producers. I was on the phone with Margie Lamb from the Annapolis Valley, who's the chairperson of Pork Nova Scotia. We've seen the challenges around the dairy sector and other agricultural producers where we lack the capacity for the ability to process some of our agricultural products locally. And so I think there's an opportunity to promote local, but there's also an opportunity to promote our processing capability. That won't come back overnight, and I'm not naive that we can change it, in a matter of a couple of years. But COVID-19 is shedding light on the importance of local food and local farmers. People like Linda Best with FarmWorks, work tirelessly in this realm to promote local food and local producers, and anything we can do to help grow our industry is going to help not only our province, but indeed the area that I represent.
Okay, thanks, Kody. And I'd just like to remind everyone on the call that any questions that you have, you can submit them through the Q&A, and we'll jump to those questions at the end. So the next question that we have is, Canada responded very quickly by shutting down non-essential businesses and placing a temporary freeze on our economy. Does the government have a solid plan in place to reopen businesses slowly to ensure that we don't reintroduce infection and ensure that we don't have a second stalled economy?
I think it's probably one of the most pressing questions that would be in the mind of business owners and Canadians alike. The Prime Minister last week actually remarked that, a lot of this is going to be directed by the provinces with hopefully some oversight and some work with the federal government. The reality is each province and each jurisdiction is on a bit of a different timeline in relation to COVID-19. So arguably Quebec and Ontario are farther along in flattening the curve and perhaps on the other side than what Nova Scotia may be, for example. So I don't think there's going to be a one uniform approach to how this goes forward. I know that there'll be collaboration with the federal government to ensure that, we do it responsibly, but it's going to be up to each province to kind of look at their own individual case numbers, their own situation, and start to gradually reopen. I will say from my perspective, and it's safe to say from the federal government's perspective, is we don't want to take a step backwards. We don't want to do this too soon, create the reinfection that was suggested in the question, and then really lose a lot of the work and sacrifice that has been done both socially and economically to try to protect lives. So I would argue that, yes, there is a plan in place. It'll be us working with the provinces in a manner to make sure that the decisions that are being made today are not going to impact us in a negative way down the road. We have to be cognizant of the second and third wave. And until we can get a vaccine that really can make either a vaccine or have a number of the population that is actually immune, this is our new normal for the time being.
So it sounds like at the highest levels of government, second and potentially third wave is a possibility.
It's certainly been discussed. I'm not on the health committee, and I don't have regular contact with either Dr. Stranger or Dr. Tam, but we're cognizant of other countries internationally that have kind of done their part, and then if they're not cognizant of testing measures and continuing the social distancing protocol, even if we're softening up the economy and allowing people back out, we are susceptible to having those types of interventions. So we need to be cognizant of that. I think Dr. Tam had suggested the analogy was, we're over one side of the mountain, we're coming down on the other side, but we're blindfolded and it's dark out. So we need to tread very carefully and make sure that we don't just go back to a kind of a full normal, which obviously would result in probably a flare up of the infection again.
Okay, thanks, Kody. So the next question we have is, what have you been doing for fun while at home during your self-isolation?
Well, I appreciate that question. It's been difficult, like all Canadians. I'm being forced to work at home. I'm very fortunate to have that capability. I'll usually take one or 2 days and head to Wolfville and work out of my office from there. But in terms of what I've been doing for fun, I'm actually working on my French. So we have the resources available at the House of Commons. So usually once a day I will check in with my professor. We'll do an hour of French, and I'm working on building that language. There's also been a lot of time kind of in the evenings, an hour or two on Netflix, and getting lots of time to walk with Kimberly and my dog, Sully.
Well, I'm sure that you're very busy, and happy to hear that you're able to take time just to get outside and get some fresh air, because I'm sure you need a break from this just as much as everybody else does every now and then.
Yeah.
So the next question that we have is that the current pandemic has caused a recession, but we all know that the financial catastrophe that we're currently experiencing pales in comparison to the climate catastrophe that we will be facing. Why is the government not taking aggressive measures to combat climate change?
So I guess what I would say is, first of all, is our government is not wavering in any way whatsoever in terms of its commitment to climate change and to being a leader on that front. I would point to our investment last week in relation to the energy sector that was focused on environmental cleanup in terms of some of the wells that had been left in years past. Obviously, our focus right now is trying to provide stabilization for Canadian businesses and individuals. But again, our investments in our mandate will include a lens of ensuring that we continue to move on that front. And I don't think that there's been any suggestion internally that will move from that point. When we formed government in 2015, we were on pace to miss our Paris Climate Accord targets. Say that 10 times. We were on pace to miss it by over 300 megatons. We closed that gap to 72 megatons in 4 years. the investments that are being talked about in terms of green energy and helping businesses and individuals be more energy efficient are meant to close that gap and even exceed it. So our government's not wavering on that target, and probably some of the measures that would be introduced to help stimulate and get the economy back moving will be focused in that regard.
Okay, thanks, Kody. So earlier, a few questions ago, we were discussing the potential second wave, and this next question is, when is the anticipated second wave of the coronavirus?
Well, I guess what I would say is I don't know if there is necessarily an anticipated second wave. It's what we do collectively as a province or a country to do our part to follow the advice of public health. What I would say is I'm taking my lead, at least in Nova Scotia, from Dr. Robert Strang, who has suggested that, perhaps late April to early May, we could be peaking in terms of our cases in the province. And he has suggested that late May to early June could be at a point where we as a province are able to start slowly introducing more and more activity into the economy and having individuals, work outside the home and things like that. So that would be the advice I'm following. And really, I have about as much information as the general public, because we're getting it every day from our public health officers. But Dr. Strang is kind of where I'm using my guideposts as a way of a return. And, certainly that is contingent on the work that we do collectively in the days ahead.
Okay, so I'm going to ask a follow-up to that. If a second wave were to hit, are there any discussions at the federal level as to what that would look like in terms of ratcheting down the economy, i.e., would we have a similar shutdown to what we're experiencing now?
Certainly, I think internally we'd be asking the questions that if this prolongs further, we're going to have other measures in place. In terms of the shutdown or what it may look like, I mean, ultimately that would be on the basis of what public health is recommending to whether it's Premier Neil or the Prime Minister in terms of what best approach would be. So in terms of what the future could hold, no one necessarily has a crystal ball. But obviously, if it got to the point that there was a re-elevation of the infection, presumably we might have to see kind of some micro examples of what we're all going through now. But it's difficult for me to speculate as I don't have that information in front of me.
Okay, thanks, Kody. So the next question that we have from a member is, when will the fire ban be lifted?
So that question in terms of the fire ban is provincial jurisdiction, and I don't want to be like the typical politician and pass the buck, but perhaps Margaret Miller can hop on a call next week and she can answer that one. It's that would be provincial jurisdiction, and really up to that government to make that choice.
Okay, thanks, Kody. And this last one here, you've already touched on a little bit, but the question is specifically around what's going to happen with businesses who their work now will be reflected in their revenue a couple months down the road. So I know that you already mentioned agriculture, but I'm just thinking of a few other businesses in terms of membership that we have that would be impacted by this as well.
So this is something internally I highlighted because there have been probably 3 or 4 different businesses that reached out to my office and said, the reality is the labor that I'm putting in right now in March, April, and May is tied to a revenue windfall or decline in a period down the road. There is a provision under the legislation that allows for a qualifying period beyond June 6th. It's not clear to me at that point whether or not we're allowing that to extend out to September. Essentially, it allows for the qualifying periods that we've mentioned, March, April, May, but also says at a point before September 2020 as well. So that has been a question that I've raised internally. If you are a business that's on the line and this is a situation that might apply to you, would encourage you to reach out to my office, explain your situation so I can help. The feedback has been incredible because it allows us to help shape policy, and MPs have had a significant influence in making adjustments as things go along. So if you're a member that's in that situation, send me an email, give me a call. Let's have a conversation about it. And as I learn more about whether or not we will be extending that out a little further beyond June 6th, as the legislation suggests, we can see if there's a way to make sure that your business is supported.
Okay, thank you, Kody. So that's all that we have in terms of prepared questions. I'm just gonna see if anyone else on the line has a question. Please, you're able to type it in now, and I'll just give it a minute to see if there's any other questions that come in.
Amy, while we're waiting for some of the questions to come in, I just want to thank everyone who's on the line tonight. You know, East Hants and obviously the surrounding areas where your membership would entail. Our community runs on the back of small businesses and your members that do an amazing job. So I know this has been a difficult time for all Canadians, but most particularly our small business community. So thank you for your continued work. Any way I can be of assistance, please reach out to my office and we'll see what we can do to try to help your particular situation.
Okay, well, I don't see any questions coming in, so obviously we must have asked some very thorough ones. But Kody, on behalf of the East Hants District Chamber of Commerce, I would like to thank you from the board, as well as on behalf of our membership, for allowing us to have this type of access and direct communication with our Member of Parliament. It means a lot to us and our business community. We're hoping to keep up great dialogue with you in the future, and we appreciate all the insights and information that you've given us here today.
Well, thank you very much. It's a privilege, and obviously, whether or not we want to host something like this again, I'm happy to come on anytime, Amy. And obviously, following kind of the pandemic that we're in, and if we can get back to a new sense of normal, look forward to working with the Chamber and your membership in the days ahead. So thanks, everyone.